Biden 2024. And a little later, bail reform in Connecticut. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond, right here. Well, it's official. Last Tuesday, President Joe Biden formally announced his 2024 reelection campaign.
When I ran for president 4 years ago, I said we're in a battle for the soul of America, and we still are.
The soul of America, he says. In Biden's announcement video, he positioned himself as the candidate who would fight for democracy, emphasizing everything from preserving Social Security to strengthening voting rights. With former President Donald Trump, the Republican frontrunner, could very well see a rematch of 2020 in 2024. So how strong of a candidate will Biden be this time around? For that and more, we're joined by three great panelists, and I'm not exaggerating. On Zoom, first off, let's talk to Dr. Bilal Sekou, Hilliard College Associate Professor of Politics and Government, University of Hartford. Good morning, Dr. Sekou.
Go Hawks, and good morning, Frankie.
Good morning to you, and good morning to, via Zoom, he's on radio again one more time, Braxton Booker, correspondent and author of the Recast newsletter at Politico. Good morning, Braxton.
What up, what up? Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on. And Democratic strategist and communications specialist, president of Polysol Public Affairs Incorporated, Nina Smith. Good morning, Nina.
Good morning. Great to be with y'all.
Thank you guys for coming on the show. And if anybody's listening and they want to give us a call, maybe they want to talk about reelection 2024 or the election of 2024, you can join the conversation 888-720-WNPR, 888-720-9677. Braxton, we played a short clip at the top. What did you make of Biden's campaign announcement?
Well, we knew it was coming. We knew it was going to be via video and not some kind of speech from someplace out in America. So, as a campaign tactic to get his message out there, I thought it was a cleanly produced video. It highlighted making him look very strong, very capable commander in chief. Right. I thought the imagery was really important. There were a lot of shots of him kind of embracing and working with Vice President Kamala Harris, and also a lot of images of him with now Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. Right, I think that signals to the base of his party that hey, he was instrumental in not only putting the first Black woman on the Supreme Court, but also he's working very closely with his top lieutenant, who was the first Black woman and first woman of Asian descent to be vice president. So I think those were just very not so subtle signals that, hey, minority voters that hung with me in 2020, look at what we've done. And, his tagline is, basically the job is still done. We're not done with this work. So give us 4 more years. So I thought from that standpoint, it was effective. But I thought the most glaring thing, and we can talk about this as we continue our conversation, is that there was no mention of immigration, which is going to be one of his Achilles heels and something that is going to, there's already proven to be a problem for him this week as he sent 1,500 active duty troops to the southern border. And certainly, I would think that his Republican opponents, those who are trying to win the nomination, are going to hammer him on.
Let's zone in on that a little bit more. I appreciate you talking about immigration there, because it has been a big issue that not only him and the vice president have had to deal with over the last first 3 years of the presidency or so here. Any other things that stood out to you in terms of issue-based things, Nina, as I bring you into this conversation?
I mean, as much as the representation was uh, front and center in the launch video. I think the theme and the framing around freedom, protecting our democracy, creates a sense of urgency that I think he's going to need going into this next election cycle. If the candidate doesn't excite for people directly, then what are other ways that you can move the electorate forward? And a lot of it is building up urgency, framing what is an existential threat to the country and our politics, which is the threat to our right to vote, the threat to our bodily autonomy as women, and birthing folks. Like it's to me, I thought the urgency was super important to convey because that is what we're facing in 2024. And it really harkens back to his original launch when he talked about the fight for the soul of a nation, and finishing the job is just a continuation and a building off of his initial launch. And I thought that was interesting.
Nina, I've heard a lot of national kind of reporters talking about the freedom aspect that you just mentioned. Is that intentional? Is there some kind of effort by, I guess, Democrats at large to take back the word freedom and the concept of what freedom actually is?
Yes, and ironically, I mean, I worked for Pete Buttigieg. I was his traveling press secretary in 2020, and that was a theme he brought forward because, a lot of our campaign was flipping on its head what typically are strengths are for Republicans into strengths for Democrats, and reframing that conversation. It's super important, and I think the new frontier in messaging, just from my nerdy standpoint, that we're finally leaning into that space and taking back the word freedom, and really, again, painting the picture of what we're going to face in 2024, which is a Republican Party in disarray and ready to take away your rights just to build up their own power.
You mentioned Pete Buttigieg, and I also understand that you worked on the Obama campaign, at least one of the reelection either the reelection campaign or was it the regular campaign?
I was in the administration. I did some work on the reelect. Yeah,
so I want to just get the kind of what should we be looking at from Biden or on in terms of the team here, how they're going to frame their 2024 campaign. What do you think? And do you think we got a little bit of that in the video?
Absolutely. And then there was another video that he just put out this week, which kind of highlighted and focused on the administration's accomplishments and the strength of the economy. I think there are two big things that the Biden campaign is going to kind of use to anchor themselves, which is going to be important, again, going into the election next year. One of which is this idea and this urgency around the election itself when it comes to freedom and protecting those freedoms. And the second part is going to be, what they have delivered on as an administration over the last going into next year, 4 years, right? Passing, legislation, record number of pieces of legislation, getting Washington functioning again in a way that delivers for the American people, 12 million more jobs, a growing stock market, growth in the GDP, all of the hallmarks of a strong economy. And hopefully those two things will, kind of be the anchors that keep them moving forward going into next year. I will say that, the economy has to kind of, it's one of those unpredictable factors. Hopefully this debt ceiling conversation will quickly move the way it needs to move if you're the Biden campaign. But, those are the two anchors, I think, that will keep this campaign moving forward.
The wheel loss is off. Go ahead. Sorry, you keep going.
Sorry. No, I was just going to say, just in terms of personnel, I also think that the representation at the top is important. Having a campaign manager who is of Latina descent, whose father was, grandfather was such a huge figure in the labor movement is super important. And then you have Quentin Folks, who came out of Georgia and helped Senator Warnock with his reelect. And those are two relatively young and dynamic individuals who will keep the campaign going forward. And I think that's pretty exciting.
We're off and running on the Wheelhouse this Wednesday, and our panelists are talking about kind of what they thought about the Biden reelection campaign video. And I want to ask you, what do you think about Joe Biden's prospects in 2024, the president? You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Bilal Siku, Nina just hinted at some of them, but what are some of Joseph Biden's strengths as a nominee? Are there any specific accomplishments he should be touting?
Right. So I think both Nina and Braxton really laid the context for the video and some of the themes that Biden will try to focus on, in his effort to be reelected. I guess I would sort of maybe frame some of these issues a little bit differently, in the sense that I think, particularly, Biden talks in the video about more freedom or less freedom, more rights or less rights. I think the larger context is to, appreciate that in the sort of larger global context of the slide in democracy that's occurring around the world, the 4 years under the Trump administration, the real worry and legitimate worry a lot of people have in the country and around the world about, right-wing populism and anti-democratic ideas that are sort of spreading, and people are really fearful for democracy and liberal democracy in particular. And so I think this will be an important thing for Biden to strike during this campaign, that he is someone who is, in support of democratic practices and institutions and a democratic sort of, having a democratic society. And I think that would be a strong theme of his campaign, going forward. I will say this, though, and I thought Braxton's comments about the black voters and both he and Nina referencing how, themes in the video was also interesting, because I think, the real concern I have about this election, because I care about turnout, is this issue of whether people will be apathetic. We have, potentially an 82-year-old and a 77 or 78-year-old who will be running. A lot of my students I talk to are not particularly enthusiastic about either of them, as candidates. I think this question about whether, Black voters will show up at the polls with the kind of energy that the Democrats need in order to be successful, I think is a real question mark. I mean, I think that Black voters in particular are concerned about some of the promises that were not fulfilled. For example, with regard to the issue of criminal justice reform, something that just did not happen as effectively as people thought it would. Questions also about voting rights in terms of protecting federal voting rights. It seems like we've forgotten those first 2 years of Joe Manchin and Christian Sinema and the difficulty of getting, those key pieces of legislation across that are really has been significant to Blacks' sort of freedom struggles in this country. And so I think Biden has to explain why those things didn't happen and how they're going to happen in that next administration if he's able to get reelected.
And Bilal's able to get right into the weaknesses there. He's the first one to bring up age, I believe, on this show. So Braxton, 2020
Yes.
and today, it's just so much talk about President Joe Biden's age. Why are people hung up on the age? Should they be hung up on the age?
Well, look, I think it's a real concern. We are now in uncharted territory where we have never had a president this old.
Not even Ronald Reagan.
I mean, Ronald Reagan appeared. When you look at old pictures now, yeah, he seems a lot older, and there are confirmation of how his aides were helping him along, certainly towards the end of his administration, kind of guarding him from the public in some regards. But in the day that we're in now with social media and having to be so present in front of so many active lenses on phones, on cameras, trained to this president 24/7, it's going to be very hard to escape. And look, I was at the White House Correspondents' Dinner over the weekend, where he both was the butt of jokes about his age, where the comic Roy Wood Jr. said, you've never seen an 80-year-old man begging the public for 4 more years. So he's going to be 84 years old by the time he gets out, because he's talking about the work is not done. It's like, where else do you see that? He's supposed to be in retirement age at this point. But I think the real issue is that, I have talked with folks that, for those of our listeners that are old enough to remember, like he is sort of one Bob Dole fall off of the stage away from having his whole presidential reelection campaign be upended. One slip up on the tarmac, and this video is going to be looped all throughout the rest of the campaign. And sure, anybody can trip, but it becomes a greater source of concern if you're seeing this elderly man do that, right? Or
Nina,
if he slips up.
Nina, is it that bad? Do you think what Braxton's talking about is that like a big concern that Democratic politicals are kind of having at this time, that there's really worried about this age thing showing up like that?
I mean, to be very honest, the last 4 years we've seen different situations from the president. He's had a fall off his bike. He slipped on the tarmac. I think we've seen these things, and I think it's always a worry. But I think what the Biden campaign has been trying to do is turn it into a strength. I think they're very, used to the question coming up. He was, if I'm not mistaken, the oldest or among the oldest nominee we've ever had in history in 2020, and that changed. So I think folks have learned to kind of flip it into a strength. I think the Dark Brandon meme is something that is very interesting and, to some degree can appeal to younger folks. So yes, it's a worry, but I think it's also something that if the Biden team has kind of been handling for the last 4 years, and they've navigated that piece. But I do think what Dr. Sekou pointed out about that conversation that he needs to have with the base, that reconnection with, folks who put him into office in the first place, and really talking about what did you deliver? What are the roadblocks? Why do you think that you didn't get it accomplished in the first 4 years? What makes you think you can do it in the next 4? I think that conversation needs to happen. And I think they are focused in that direction. But I also think that they've, kind of figured out how to navigate those pieces. And so it's a concern, but I don't think it's as front and center as it would be had they not handled his various situations and encounters over the last 4 years.
But a question for you, Nina, how does he go about having that conversation, right? When we're talking about, let's say, voting rights, right? Like the major hiccup or the major hangup was that he could not keep his party together. He could not keep Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema on the same page to change the filibuster rule. Now that is a difficult conversation because he needs Joe Manchin's vote in a number of things that he's trying to get passed in this current Senate, right? So he's not trying to alienate someone who's also thought to be mulling a third party run, which could be very damaging to President Biden's reelection, right? But I mean, not wanting to change the filibuster rule, which Biden had previously said he didn't want to change, but when it came to voting rights, he was open to it. And then having members of his own party kind of block that path, that's a tough conversation to go have with your base and say, well, I tried, but it was people in my own party that stopped us from moving forward on that, because we knew we weren't going to get Republican support on that. How does he have that conversation and make that a winning argument for 4 more years with the base?
Nina?
I mean, I think oh, thank you, Frankie. I think he counters
how do you want to hear that conversation?
Well, I mean, to me, I think if he, the counter there is that, if I'm not mistaken, this administration has appointed the most judges to the high court than any other. And through those appointments, you are able to block what has currently happened. And, unfortunately, things could be a lot worse. I think with a Democratic president, with someone who is very interested in finding a resolution and in protecting voting rights, that is a much better bet than somebody in a party that has zero interest in expanding voting rights, who has done everything in their power to make voting harder, who has jailed people who have tried to honestly vote. And, and as we've seen in Florida, we now have election police. So I think again, the contrast comes up, and it's very clear what the other side is offering and what Joe Biden is offering. Yes, it's a tough conversation. Yes, the track record isn't great, particularly for the Democratic Party. That said, we know that the party supports voting rights. We know the party supports expanding voting rights and protecting, believes that voting is a sacred right that everyone should have access to, every eligible voter should have access to. And it's very clear on the other side that there's zero interest in a real solution on immigration. There's zero interest in a real resolution on voting rights that expands access rather than constricts it. So, I think when you're having that conversation with, in particular, base voters, it's really important, and hopefully they will get to a place where they're framing it that way with voters and saying, listen, at least you can have a conversation with us. At least we're talking. In this other situation, there is no talking. There's possible jail time. There's more restriction. And I think that contrast is very clear.
This segment's winding down here in a hurry, so we're going to take a phone call here from our friend in Stanford. Jake, go ahead. What do you got? You're on the wheelhouse.
Thanks for taking my call. I just wanted to kind of connect the framing of this election being about democracy and voting rights for the Biden campaign, and what Bilal brought up about potential for trouble with voter turnout, especially among young people. I think that there is to what Nina just brought up, I think that there's an issue sometimes with young people being skeptical, deservedly, of their vote mattering and being skeptical of democracy because we don't see progress or change even when we do vote for Democrats, right? And I feel like that's a pitfall that we haven't really mentioned and that Democrats don't always consider is young people's skepticism of democracy. So I just wonder what the guests think about that.
Thank you so much, Jake. I'm going right to you, Bilal. We only have about a minute or so. What do you got to try to kind of button up that call?
Well, I think the caller is absolutely right. Someone who teaches young people, that skepticism runs very, very deep. And to say that they are not pleased with the idea of a rerun of Biden and Trump, I can't, say enough about how that really bores the heck out of them. And it's something that they do not want to see. But at the same time, I think the threat that they see from Republicans and from Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis may be enough to motivate many of them to turn out for many reasons that Nina and Braxton have raised, whether it's women's right to choose, issues around voting rights, racial equity. And, and again, the Trump administration, those 4 years really frightened a lot of people.
Trump, Biden 2024 may be a rerun, but this ain't a rerun. We are live. This is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. You can join the conversation. 888-720-9677. Stay tuned. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. And if you're just joining us, we've been talking about President Joe Biden's prospects for 2024. And we're joined by a truly dynamic trio. Dr. Bilal Sekou, the Hilliard College Associate Professor of Politics and Government, University of Hartford. Braxton Booker, correspondent and author of the Recast newsletter at Politico. And Nina Smith, Democratic strategist and communications specialist, also the president of PolySoul Public Affairs Incorporated. Great conversation we're having. You can join it, 888-720-9677. Nina, we know that black voters, especially black women, saved Biden's campaign last time around. Do you think that Joe Biden still has the support of black voters, especially black women?
Yes, I do. And I'll say that because something that we talked through in the last segment is really around the urgency of the moment and what the Republicans are presenting to us on the other side. I've maintained this. I believe I've said it to Braxton, but I do believe that Black folks, young people, people of color in general are persuasion groups. Yes, they're not the typical swing voter in terms of issues, but they are swing voters in terms of whether they're going to show up. And I think when given, the option between what the Republicans are presenting and what the Democrats are presenting, the choice is very clear and the threat is very clear going into next year's election.
But also, Frank, I think one thing that will really be important about this election will be who exactly does Joe Biden face in the general election. So I think, if it ends up being a DeSantis or a Donald Trump as the opponent that he faces, I think that enthusiasm gap may narrow. I think that people will see them as being threats, especially for Black and brown voters, the attacks on not only women's rights, but the issues around CRT, LGBTQ rights. I mean, these have become central themes, things that used to be on the periphery of our politics are now at the center of Republican Party politics. And so those things really scare a lot of people. They divide the country very deeply. But it is also those kinds of issues that the number of young people do in fact care about, and people of color do see them as threats and see, the attacks on CRT and the attacks on teaching Black history as an effort to erase Black people from American history. And so that may in fact motivate people. And so I think those two candidates may make the difference with regard to whether voters see this as an election they need to show up for and turn out in large numbers to make sure neither of them win. I think it gets a bit more tricky if it's someone like Nikki Haley or Tim Scott, perhaps, who wins the nomination, which, at this point seems like far shots that they will be able to do that. But I think who Biden faces may make the difference about whether age becomes an issue. For example, the contrast between Trump and Biden is less stark than the contrast between a Biden and, say, a Nikki Haley, or for that matter, a DeSantis who's in his 40s, I believe, as well. And so depends on who he's facing in terms of some of those perceived weaknesses, whether they will really matter. And if people see a Trump or a DeSantis and feel like this is moving America closer towards authoritarianism and a liberal democracy, then I think that may be enough to motivate people to show up at the polls.
What about Black men? What about Black men?
I think that is the question right there, right? I mean, from what we're seeing, your question about Black women, I think, and Nina's answer was spot on. I think Black women, by and large, are the most supportive voting bloc of President Biden, right? It's when you break it down by Black men that you see some of these figures starting to appear. I think, if you're looking just sheer numbers, it's still roughly, 85% of Black men that still support Democratic candidates across the board. But even when we're seeing in 2022, the last midterms, Black voters made the difference in whether or not in Wisconsin, and were largely thought of as being the difference between why Mandela Barnes is not a sitting senator from Wisconsin and Senator Johnson remained in office. It's because Black folks did not turn out in Milwaukee, which is a big stronghold. And we're also seeing there's a report out from the Washington Post today that said Black voter turnout dropped about 10% between the last midterm in 2018 and last year's midterms. But it's because Republicans have been making a concerted effort to attract Black men. And so moving forward, and Terrence Woodbury, a very popular strategist who works with Democratic candidates, has worked with NAACP, he's kind of ringing the alarm about this, about how the party is losing small percentages of Black men. But like, if you lose enough percentages in the right places, you start to see that may turn the tide for elections in states and races all across the country. So both parties need to make a concerted effort at this group, because this group is more and more up for grabs. And if Democrats want to maintain their hold kind of on Black voters, they're going to have to make a concerted effort to bring Black men into the fold.
Well, Bragdon just proved my point about them being persuasion voters. These are voters that the Republican Party is trying to court. These are voters that Democrats know that they have to engage and persuade. And there are a number of organizations that are out there talking to Black men. I was a part of the Abrams campaign. Talking to Black men was a huge part of our campaign. But, the thing is, and I want to make sure that it's very clear, Black men are the second most reliable voting bloc for the Democrats. And again, they are persuasion voters, just like Black women are persuasion voters, just like young people are persuasion voters. And we need to start thinking about them like that. And it looks like the Democratic Party is starting to, but it has to be a real effort, and it has to go into investment and organizing.
But something it sounds like the Democratic Party may not be able to rely on this time around is these white working class women. I guess there's a big concern in listening to some of the national reporters speak about this in the Biden campaign's ability to appeal to white women voters.
Yeah, I think you're right, Frankie, in terms of that. It'll be interesting to see how the Dodd decision plays out and how women, view, the choice between the Republicans and Democrats for control, not only the presidency, but also the Senate will be in play this time around. And there are some projections that the Senate may go Republican. And so I think, when we think about Dodd, when we think about some of these, harsh and draconian laws that are being passed around abortion rights, these things may in fact motivate a lot of suburban women to show up at the polls. I think the thing we have to also understand about voting, I saw one study that said perhaps a third of all voters in 2020 actually voted for the candidate they voted for, not because they were for that person, but because they were against the other person. And so I think, this threat that Republicans may pose to women's rights, to abortion rights, to voting rights, that voters may perceive may be enough to motivate a lot of them to turn out. And I think the final thing I'll say is, what we haven't talked about, I think will also be instrumental or key in this election will be Latino voters as well. The Republican Party has been making some inroads with Latino voters, I think, but if the Democrats are going to build this kind of multiracial, inclusive democracy and have a political party that is as diverse as the Democratic Party is compared to Republicans, at the end of the day, the Republicans are a mostly white political party in which white nationalism and the creeping authoritarianism has taken hold among a lot of that base. And so this is a part of the message that Democrats have to put out there about, protecting, saving democracy, building a multiracial and inclusive democracy that, that we will see economic and political opportunities for all will be a key part of what Biden has to do.
And really quickly, Bilal, the support, do you think it's going to change here in Connecticut? We're in a state that's really solidly blue, but do you think that Biden's support will, I guess, prosper or wane this time around? What do you think? Just really quickly.
I actually think Biden is going to win Connecticut as usual. The real question will be what will happen in our state level politics. Again, if there's not enthusiasm in the cities, how does that affect some of our state races? For a state senator, some of our, statewide offices and other things. And I think that's really the key question. So you have to get an enthusiastic turnout from voters. The Democratic Party in Connecticut, just like it does nationally, depends a lot on urban and, Black and Latino voters for support to be successful. And so you've got to energize that base on a regular basis.
Insert head into desk emoji, because I'm really upset that I got to end the segment and end this conversation that I'm having with this great trio of guests. Nina Smith, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Bragdon Booker, and of course, Dr. Bilal Sekou. Thank you guys for coming on today. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
From Connecticut, you as well. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is The Wheelhouse. Right up next, we have Jaden Edison on bail reform. Keep listening. Thank you. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. We move now from Biden to bail reform. Connecticut's bail system could see some major changes in the future if a proposal currently before state lawmakers passes. For more on that, we got a good one and a good friend of the show, Jaden Edison, justice reporter, Connecticut Mirror. Good morning, Jaden.
Thanks for having me. How you doing?
Thank you. A lot of pressure on you to follow up that great conversation that we had on the Biden reelection campaign, but this is an important conversation that we're about to have. The bail process, Jaden, just really quickly, how does it currently work in Connecticut?
So the way bail currently works at large, right, is, well, first, I think in layman's terms, right, when we're talking about bail, it's important to make the distinction, right? Like there's bail, the noun, and there's bail, the verb, right? And so what most people talk about when they talk about bail is cash bail, right? Where you pay money as a deposit for the release of, a person, who's arrested, right? And then there's also the verb, which is overall the process of releasing, an accused person with certain conditions. So it's important to make the distinction right at the onset. But essentially, when someone, wants to, post bail, there are really three options in Connecticut at the moment, right? You have a person who can post bail by paying the full amount. They can pay 10% of the amount if that total is $20,000 or less, or they can pay a bail bonds agency, which they don't have the opportunity for a refund in that scenario, and they do in the former two. And the bail bondsman also kind of gives them, an option for a payment plan, et cetera, et cetera. But largely, when you look at the Connecticut Constitution, it's a very interesting provision, right? Because currently the way the Constitution is constructed, you can only deny bail to someone who's committed of a capital offense, which we know that since 2012, since capital punishment was abolished, that provision is essentially obsolete, which means that people people accused of committing, the most, heinous crimes, right, which is now considered what they call murder with special circumstances, right, which have replaced capital offenses in a way. Those people, in every case that I've seen thus far, are people who are entitled to bail. So lawmakers essentially see a problem where you have people, who, if they have the means, regardless of what crime they're accused of committing, they're eligible for pretrial detention. On the other hand, you have folks who are, not considered dangerous, but if they don't have the means, they're languishing behind bars pre-trial. So a very interesting conversation that we're having, but that's the landscape right now that we're currently working with.
You talked about bail. What about bail reform?
Yeah, and that's precisely, when we talk about bail reform, I think it's particularly what I just mentioned with, lawmakers see House Joint Resolution. So this is what we're talking about, right? House Joint Resolution. So it's a legislation that was proposed that seeks to amend the Constitution to fix the very provision that I just noted when it comes to the capital offenses, again, which capital offenses are now obsolete, null and void in Connecticut. So what lawmakers are hoping to do with, what they call House Joint Resolution 261, what they're hoping to do is amend the Constitution to now establish a risk-based pretrial system, right? So you're establishing a risk-based pretrial system, which essentially means that a judge is able to assess someone's flight risk or threat to public safety, et cetera, et cetera. And in that case, they'd be able to deny bail to people who they deem, again, a threat to public safety or someone at flight risk, so on and so forth. The more interesting part to this, right, where it gets a little tricky, is it will also give the legislature authority to set additional pre-trial conditions, around, again, pre-trial release, which could end up being any, number of things, down the line. And so it's kind of unclear as to where the state's going to go with this. But that's the most kind of bare bones, basic, foundational, goal right now, is to seek to amend the Constitution so they can have more conversations about exactly what reform needs to take place.
And that process with the constitutional amendment, could you kind of lay out that for us? And more importantly, how long that could potentially take?
Yeah, so I know for our listeners here, if you remember early voting, I would think of this in those same terms, right? So when you have, a proposal to amend the Constitution, if you propose an amendment, right, it has to pass out of committee first. So whatever appropriate committee, which this particular resolution did pass out of the Judiciary Committee and the Government Administration and Elections Committee. So it crossed off that. From there, it has to pass through the House and Senate with either 3/4 majority support in one legislative term, or a simple majority in 2 successive legislative terms, which it seems to me that the latter is more of a likelihood. But from there, right, it would have to garner the majority support among voters. So it would go to the ballot, which that could happen as soon as the 2024 general election, or could happen as late as the 2026 midterm election. From there, if it passed among voters, right, similar to how we saw with early voting, the amendment will become part of the Constitution, and it will give lawmakers that green light, right, that pathway to debate and settle upon additional changes to bail. So again, as we saw with early voting, that was something that took years and years and years and failed one time when it actually reached the voters, and then more recently in the last election was able to pass. This is very similar in terms of the process. We could very well see this same thing play out similarly.
I've got a voice in my head saying, land of steady habits. And when I hear that, when you're talking about 2024 to 2026, if I had some money in my pocket, I might put it on 2026 or later. You talked about pretrial conditions that could appear as part of this constitutional amendment that would be put in place by lawmakers. What kind of changes might they make?
Yeah, so, and this is the part, right? So I think is very important, right? Is that people understand is that the constitutional amendment, all it does is it gives the pathway to be able to have that conversation, right? Again, we talk about capital offenses being obsolete. So you're able, that provision, that change will become part of the Constitution. But additionally, again, like as I mentioned before, the key part is what happens with lawmakers. So giving lawmakers that ability means that we can end up a variety of different things. I think one place to look at is New Jersey, right? New Jersey has similar constitutional language as Connecticut currently has, right? Which many people feel is outdated, which is the whole reason essentially for this proposal. New Jersey, after years and years and years of debate, and this is something that got bipartisan support, but they now have a system where judges assess whether a person gets released on their own recognizance and under what conditions. And so Connecticut, not to say that Connecticut is going in that direction, because Connecticut could, they may not go as far as New Jersey, but that doesn't mean that they're, eliminating, cash bail, or it's just unclear at the moment where they could go. But there are a number of options that could take place. And again, I think New Jersey is an interesting case study, right? Because since that change, you've seen the state's pretrial jail population decrease along with overall crime and violent crime. And so what Connecticut likely, they can move to a system where you have the most people who, are charged with, misdemeanors and so on and so forth. Those people will be released. So you would have a bunch of less people who are locked up pre-trial, but you would also have a system where perhaps people who are deemed the most dangerous would be held. But again, it's not as clear cut as that. But there are a number of options that the state could choose to go.
And I think you kind of leaned into it a little bit, but let's go even further. You're talking about people with misdemeanors. We're discussing some of the people that I guess are going to be helped out most by this. Any further take on that?
I mean, it's similar. We've had these conversations before, right? When you look at Connecticut's makeup in terms of the demographics of people who are incarcerated, I mean, we said this: people of color and low-income people are overwhelmingly incarcerated, disproportionately incarcerated in Connecticut. I think people of color make up more than 70% of the people who are incarcerated at large, which is a stark contrast to the demographics outlined in the U.S. Census, right? So again, you have the pretrial detention at the moment, at least in 2022, was the highest it had been since 2013. So you have more people who are, again, languishing behind bars pretrial, a good number of whom, right, are people who perhaps have, low-level accusations, low-level charges, but they don't have the means to get out. And we've seen that play out in recent cases. One thing in the recent story that we reported at the Mirror is you have a guy, Brandon, Grant Ford, who, in a nutshell, was charged with murder, faced $500,000 bail, went through the whole process, sat behind bars for several years, and a jury found him not guilty. So again, that may be an extreme example, but it just gives you a sort of case study of how the system isn't necessarily working for, people on, quote unquote, the low end of the spectrum, people with low income who don't have the means to get out, versus people, again, who have, who have wealth or who have the means or who have a support system. They have more of a pathway regardless of what charges, they accumulate.
You're talking there about who can't afford bail. What does it mean when you deny someone bail?
Yeah, I mean, so when you deny someone bail, it means a number of things, right? I think when you speak with grassroots organizers, right, first and foremost, all the time that you're spending behind bars is time that you're not able to prepare, for a case that could potentially, demonstrate, your innocence, right? It's difficult for someone to collect evidence to do that if you're, behind bars. And then also, I mean, if we're being honest, right, wrongful convictions have also been, outlined in Connecticut, right? So, and I say that to say is that everybody who's incarcerated pre-trial is not someone who's guilty, right? It's not. And so, when you take away that ability, per se, when you take away that ability, advocates have outlined this, right, where they believe that you're essentially saying that a person is guilty and they are likely guilty of the crime they committed, which again, Connecticut's history and of, again, wrongful convictions and the discussions that we're having, again, around pretrial release and who's able to be detained and who's not, it's just not as always clear cut. So I think, trying to amend the Constitution and to have this conversation, there are just so many, various things, right? You speak with the chief public defender, right, who outlined, if someone's incarcerated pre-trial, what happens to their house? What happens to their jobs? What happens to their family members? Like, there are real, consequences to that. So it's not just as clear cut as, hey, let's make these changes to bail. And it's as clear cut as, we have a problem on one end of the spectrum, one end on the other end. I mean, it really is quite the job for legislators to in the coming years.
Important questions to consider as this legislation comes up. And just really quickly, as we wrap up this conversation on bail reform, Jaden, what are the biggest obstacles to getting this passed? What do you think about the chances?
So we talk about obstacles, right? I think the biggest thing is going to be misinformation and disinformation, right? I mean, I've already seen thus far, bail bonds agencies nationally, headlines, hey, Connecticut is looking to end cash bail, which just isn't true, right? If the legislature wanted to end or put an end to monetary bail, they could technically do that right now without amending the Constitution. And so, again, as we've seen in places like Illinois and New York and New Jersey, fear mongering around bail and about crime, Connecticut has its hands full, right? Because we know that, there are concerns, in the state when it comes to issues around criminal justice. So this is very much a part of that category. And so I think it's going to be up to lawmakers and the people, who have the power, to have these discussions. I mean, there's a need for an educational sort of campaign around, what exactly the state is hoping to do and giving voters and giving the general public insight into exactly what that is and informing them about things that perhaps they maybe hadn't thought about before. So I think that's a really big part of it, and a key part, as we saw with early voting, that could go in a number of places. So that's something
Jaden Edison, Justice reporter, thank you so much for giving us a good big clue into what's happening with bail reform in Connecticut. Thank you for joining us this morning, Jaden.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
I'm Frankie Graziano. Today's show, a great show produced by Meg Dalton, technical producer Dylan Reyes, and thanks to Katie Tolarski for helping us in studio. You can download The Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. This is The Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening.
Support for Fair